All right, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to Thinning the Debate, a community forum on the Healthy Forest Initiative. I want to thank the panelists for coming tonight and taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in this forum. We have quite a group of dynamic panelists who are going to discuss different aspects of the Healthy Forest Initiative. This event was organized by the Environmental Action Community, which is a student group on campus. This past year, we've been focusing on forest issues. Last fall, we started a forest monitoring program where we've gone out to the forests and forest monitored where fires have burned and gone up to proposed timber sales to see how our forests are going to be managed and what is going on. We have also learned more about what's going on in our forests through different different presentations and discussions during our weekly meetings. So if you guys are interested and want to get involved, come talk to me after the panel presentation, or if you have any questions, let me know. The EAC decided to organize this event because there's been a lot of changes in the way our forests are managed. The Bush administration introduced the Healthy Forest Initiative, which is a combination of legislative and administrative changes to forest policy. Most recently, Congress passed H.R. 1904, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, in November of 2003. The objective of this legislation is to expedite procedures for forest thinning and restoration projects to ensure sustainable forest management and appropriate timber production. These new management procedures have become the focus of intense technical, political, and legal controversy. Some believe the Healthy Forest Initiative will protect human lives and property and bring jobs to rural communities. Others believe that the Healthy Forest Initiative will weaken environmental laws and open up the doors to more logging. This panel presentation will provide an opportunity to explore the political landscape of how our forests are managed and discuss the reactions to the Healthy Forest Initiative. So we're going to give you guys a chance at the end of the panel presentation to ask any of the panelists some questions. So basically the format of the panel is we have 4 panelists. Each are going to speak for about 20 minutes. And then after that, Martin and I will be moderating the question and answer session. So first we are going to start off with Professor Wakamoto. He's a forestry professor on campus, and he is going to set the stage with talking about fire ecology. Next, Debbie Austin, the Lolo Forest Supervisor, is going to talk about what the Healthy Forest Initiative is, talk about what's going on with that. Following Debbie Austin will be Tom Power, and he's a professor of economics. And he's going to talk about economic issues associated with the Healthy Forest Initiative and economics of logging. And finally, Matthew Kaler from the Native Forest Network is going to talk about environmental issues associated with the Healthy Forest Initiative. So I'd like to welcome Ron Wakamoto, tell you a little bit about him, and then let him talk. So Dr. Ron Wakamoto is a professor of forestry at the University of Montana in Missoula. He received his BS in forestry, MS, and PhD in wildland resource sciences from the University of California, Berkeley. He began his faculty career at the University of California in 1976 and has been at the University of Montana since 1982. He's also been conducting research in wildland fire management. He teaches academic courses in wildland fire management, fuel management, and fire ecology. He is currently conducting research on the social acceptability of fuel management treatments, smoke quality and quantity for smoldering combustion, and fire safety. In 1988 and 89, he was one of the 2 academics to serve as technical advisors for the National Fire Policy Review Team following the Yellowstone fires. So I'd like to welcome Ron Wakamoto.
It's on right now? Yeah, I can hear it now. All right, now I can hear it, yes. Wow, it's kind of, I've got these 20 minutes to kind of talk to you about how the forest grew without us, I guess is how I put it. And when I talk about the forest, and particularly we're talking about the forest in the western United States, fire is a very important part of that forest, primarily because the forest grows and we get very limited decomposition. I think you have to think those things together. What decomposes those fuels? What allows those nutrients to cycle? In some of our sites, It is fire primarily that cycles those nutrients. In other sites, insects and fungi break that material down to have adequate decomposition. So I want to talk about that. And when we talk about fire in general, and I've got to communicate to you folks about what that forest was like, the first thing, and I don't want to just sound like I'm giving this lecture, but I give the lecture for 180, Forestry 180 in the same room, so some people may have heard some of this stuff. Okay? We try to characterize the role of fire by looking at fire histories. And when we look at fire histories, I'm excited to have Jim Habeck out here in the audience because he's done a great deal of it here in western Montana and many parts of the West. And so I'm going to kind of characterize some of the things that he's shown us, and in particular try to relate that to places you here in Missoula can see. One of those areas is Paddy Canyon. When we look at Paddy Canyon, thanks to the work that Jim did, we find that for a long period of time, probably 1600 to about 1870 or so, the average number of years between fires, the mean fire interval for Paddy Canyon was about 8 years. That's from the record in the trees. The fires were very frequent there. And I want to remind you that in Paddy Canyon, when you see a record in the tree, that's a scarring fire on the trees. So there were probably more fires. Some of them were so low intensity that they didn't even scar the trees. So that's the maximum number of years between fires. Often people, well, we just had that big article in the paper, Jim reminded me of that, where they talked about, they had this PR firm in California representing Region 5, not even review the material and show pictures of the Bitterroot Forest and call it the Sierra Nevada. Well, there are plenty of pictures of the Sierra Nevada, all right? And I think if you're interested in that, George Gruell, Gruell, just published a book, from Mountain Press here in Montana that shows those pictures of California and the radical changes in vegetation. But because of Jim's work here, we have a better idea of Paddy Canyon, and I think most of you have been there, kind of think about the trees, think about the density of trees that are there. And Jim's early work looked at the records of the surveyors in the area. Surveyors have to put these section corners in, and they have to monument those section corners, and they have to be able to cross-reference those section corners, and they use trees to do that. Some of you may when you're hiking, come across what's called a witness tree. We paint them all red, big yellow signs on them. It's a federal offense to cut those trees down because they're very important to the social side of our management of forests and living in the forest, land ownership and land tenure. When Jim looked through that, I want you to understand that in Paddy Canyon, with this high fire frequency, there were hundreds of feet, maybe hundreds of yards between trees. Between trees, hundreds of feet between trees. Okay? So we're not talking about what you see there. A lot of people drive up that nice road up through Paddy Canyon, go to the picnic area, and think they're looking at the forest primeval. That's a very natural forest. And I want to tell you, it's a very unnatural forest. They're where there were probably 50 trees per acre, there are now 4,000 trees per acre. All right? We talked about the fact that this is called the thinning debate. Where we're talking about are these forests, where there's appropriate thinning or where we might achieve some change in stand structure, some change in species composition so that it might look like historic fire and historic forests that grew without us. It's going to be in these kind of forests, the forests that had a high frequency, low intensity fires as a natural process. Now, everybody always asks me, well, how can you be so sure that these were low intensity fires? How unreasonable. I think there's some terms in the Healthy Forest Act that talk about, extremes in fire. And I'll just remind you that we got this forest record, great deal of the forest record, by looking at fire scars in these trees. And those trees lived to tell us that. They survived 20 fires in their lifetime, and they died in the next. Another example of that high mortality and that change in the forest, I want to emphasize this change in species composition. You know, I think most people recognize ponderosa pine are these trees with the long 7, 8-inch needles, 3 needles per bunch or fascicle. Big puffy trees. Those trees have thick bark at a young age. They'd better, or they'd be killed by that fire. In contrast to that, the bulk of the trees on many of our sites in western Montana are dominated by Douglas fir. They're dominated by Douglas fir because we changed the rules of the game. It's just as if we could protect a place so that rain didn't come down. Fire occurrence in these forests in western Montana are about as common as wind and rain. And we changed the rules. So if you change those rules, what happens? You find that you have trees that are spread more long distance by wind. Ponderosa pine is not. You're also dealing with trees that the young seedlings can grow down through organic material, you know, through the litter and the duff layer, get their roots started and grow. They don't need bare mineral soil post-fire. And so the rules of the game changed, and our forests are dominated by Douglas fir. If you look at the Bitterroot fires in 2000, we saw massive mortality in trees that people thought, oh, they should be able to take fire. You have to understand that those trees had never seen a fire in their lifetime. Okay? If you look at the record in the trees in western Montana and most of the western United States, about 1870, 1880, fires stopped. Fires stopped. And primary reason there, elimination of native people who lit a lot of fires to manage this land for a variety of reasons, and I don't want to go through all of those now. And in the lower elevation forests, these ponderosa pine forests, a great deal of extensive grazing that eliminated the fine fuels even when we got a lightning-caused fire. All right? So in addition, we have a great deal of lightning here. And if you look at lightning, we get about 16,000, well, about 1,600 downstrikes per year. An average in 10 years, about 1,600 downstrikes per year, cause about 600 fires in Missoula County alone. Okay, wildland fires. So there's no question that there were sources, and native people were a very important source, and we eliminated them about that time. We also grazed those lower elevation forests so there was no fuel to carry a fire. And I want to emphasize this part before I kind of change the forest. If you think about it, we could have a lightning fire start on the west side of the Bitterroot Valley in that open ponderosa pine. It would have been very open, park-like, grass understory. There had been no Highway 93 there. The fire could have slowly moved, got more windy in the valley, easily spotted across the Bitterroot River, which it does even now, move and slowly move through the summer since there was no one there to put it out, and if the rainstorms didn't happen, you know, hot, dry summer, and eventually go towards Phillipsburg in the late fall and lodgepole pine begin to crown. So it didn't take a lot of ignitions to really change the landscape. Okay, now we have all these other constraints that prevent fires from moving and changing those landscapes for most of the time, except when, you know, nature really wants to show us who's boss. So those forests that have grown up or were originally adapted to high frequency, low intensity fire, they have a very serious change in stand structure. We have many, many trees when nature would have killed those trees. I'm often asked that by students. You know, would the fire really take out all those Douglas fir? And I'll say this, if you light in-season fires or you light fall fires, you will kill almost 99% of the Douglas fir less than 20 feet tall on a site. You will kill those trees. If you just get the fire to go by them, they will all die. I think most people think, oh, this tree's, you know, it's 20 feet tall, it'll survive the fire. Just burning the litter and the duff around that tree will kill those trees. There's no question of that. And yet, so there are dramatic changes that will happen, and they do happen when we have these fires move through our forest. Now, that's only part of the forest. You know, we have this Healthy Forest Act that's talking about the management of all our wildlands, and I do want to remind you that a great deal of Montana also has forests that are naturally adapted to very low frequency, high intensity fire. And those are primarily dominated by lodgepole pine, very different tree, short pine needles, maybe 2 or 3 inches long, 2 needles per bunch. Those trees historically burned with very infrequent fire, something like 65 to maybe 150 years here in western Montana. Yellowstone Park, that of course burned up in '88, a great deal of it burned up in '88. Yellowstone Park is a real difficult place to grow trees, so the fuels accumulate very slowly, and mean fire intervals there being more in the 150 to 300 year range. Okay? Montana forests, fortunately, are more productive even in lodgepole pine than that. Those forests, people would say, well, how do you regenerate a forest that burns naturally that intensely? You see the pictures in the news that say these areas are destroyed by fire. Okay? Those trees are adapted to it. They have serotinous cones that stay closed until the fire kills that tree, and then after the tree is dead, hopefully after the tree is dead, and the crown's burned off the tree, then sunlight slowly heats and opens those cones. If the fire were to open those cones, most of those seeds burn up. They're killed by the fire. So when you walk into an area of lodgepole pine, you can readily see that because you walk out there and look at the black trees and you'll see bright, shiny brown cones. And that meant that the fire burned off the crown and the sunlight heated that cone, slowly melted those resins, and the cone opened. You'll find lots of seeds there. So that forest is a very different kind of forest. And I want to say this, fire as a rule did not thin those kinds of forests. Okay? They did not thin those kinds of forests. They might have killed in groups, they killed in patches, because a simple surface fire, and that's something we saw in Yellowstone a great deal, where spot fires would start, but the area wouldn't crown. But if the litter were to be consumed, the litter and the duff were to be consumed, all those trees die. They would be bright green, not a scorched needle in the tree. They all die. They have very little fire resistance. So, when you think about this idea of reducing stocking, thinning the trees, in lodgepole pine, it's a pretty hard sell for me, because when you thin stands of trees, you make them hotter, drier, and windier in the understory. And more importantly, this is called the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Those trees will not survive a fire. Any surface fire in lodgepole pine will kill all the trees. You just have to understand that. And something that I've tried to bring across to Congress repeatedly is that one particular kind of fix is not going to make it. In sharp contrast to that, in the areas of ponderosa pine, I want to say another caveat there. Certainly thinning, change in species composition, changes in stand structure can provide relatively fireproof stands that are resilient enough if there's an adequate fuel treatment to the ground. Right now, I get emails and calls from Region 5, California, where there are fuel managers who are doing squirrely stuff there. I just want to say that, where it's absolutely remarkable that an environmental analysis can say that adequate fuel treatment in the understory of ponderosa pine will reduce the fuel load to a fuel model 11. Okay? I'm probably talking Greek there. A fuel model 11 is light logging slash. In other words, if a surface fire were to go through that stand, it would kill all the trees. Now, if we treat the stand and we still kill all the trees, is that really an objective that we should be trying to reach? And what happens is they don't have the money, they're not willing to spend the money to treat the fuels adequately to reduce that stocking, or reduce the fuels on the ground. People just don't have a feeling for that. And while I'm talking about Region 5, California, I should dwell on this a little bit. I used to teach there, and I worked in the Sierras, and I lit fires in the Sierras. And you ain't seen nothing if you've been in Montana. When you go to the Sierra Nevada forest, you will see fuels that are hard to imagine, 400 tons per acre in many places, where the average log is 20 or 30, 40 inches in diameter laying on the ground, where the fire, any fire, would be severe enough to kill all the trees. So it's a very different game. The other thing, when we talk about changing stand structure and composition in the forests that had high frequency fire, The tree that it played exactly the same role as the Douglas fir in Montana, that are roughly, well, a large tree might be 15, 16 inches in diameter, that, you know, invaded the stand because of exclusion of fire, grew in the understory, and then was released by removing the overstory. The tree that played that same role in the Sierra Nevadas is a white fir, Abies concolor. And when you go to the stands like that in the Sierras, you know, the Sierras are much more productive. And when you go there, those trees are 30 to 50 inches in diameter. So if you buy the story that we should restore these stands, reduce the stocking, control species composition, remove those trees, then we really are removing quite large trees. Most people think that big trees are old trees. That's not necessarily true where trees grow well. So I just want to emphasize that while we have, you know, one law, we have an agency that has to carry, or various agencies that have to carry out that law. There's a wide disparaging difference in the ecological setting. The reasons for that setting probably are about the same, the exclusion of fire and the removal of Native Americans. But at the same time, the solution is quite different because of the magnitude of the problem. I think I'll stop there and, well, let me give me one more point here. These things keep popping in my head. You know, right now we're talking about restoration of stands. And there are a lot of foresters, particularly silviculturists, who kind of think, okay, we'll reduce the stocking, we'll change the species composition, we'll run a fire, and we'll reduce the understory fuels, and everything will be good. We'll get ponderosa pine as a tree that'll move back into the site. And I just want you to think about this natural process, and I have to remind my students of that all the time, that regeneration of ponderosa pine is very different. When you think about it, imagine that you're pulling the arm on a slot machine. An Australian kind of gave me this analogy before, where you pull a handle on a slot machine, and to get regeneration in ponderosa pine, you have to have the seeds in the tree, okay? Doesn't happen every year. Maybe once every 8 to 10 years is there a decent ponderosa pine seed crop. It takes 2 years to produce seeds in pines. So you have to have those seeds already there. You have to run your fire that particular year when you pull the handle on the slot machine. And then the following spring has to be adequate moisture so those seedlings survive. Okay? Think about that. If you look at historic stands of ponderosa pine, there are even-aged groups of trees that came from particular years when nature pulled the handle on the slot machine. She pulled it a whole lot. Every 8 to 10 years, she's pulling that handle, and yet there's a lot of places where we have no regeneration at all during those pulls of the handle because we didn't have one of those 3 cherries not show up. So to think that you can thin the stand, reintroduce fire to that stand, and then get ponderosa pine regeneration is foolishness. Because we're pulling the handle once in 100 years when nature would have pulled it 10 times. Okay? I just want you to think that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Wakamoto. And I'd like to introduce you to Debbie Austin, the Lolo National Forest Supervisor. Debbie was born and raised in Palo Alto, California. She spent most of her childhood riding her horses in the mountains, where she gained an appreciation for the outdoors and natural resources. She attended Humboldt State University in Arcata, California, where she received a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife management with emphasis areas in range management and outdoor recreation. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree in biology with a minor in botany. Debbie began her Forest Service career as a temporary firefighter in the Tahoe National Forest in 1978. She worked on 8 national forests in 4 of the western regions of the Forest Service. Her jobs have included firefighter, fish and wildlife biologist, range conservationist, district resource assistant, district ranger, and forest supervisor. Debbie moved to Montana in 1995 when she took the job of forest supervisor on the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest in Dillon. She is currently the forest supervisor on the Lolo National Forest in Missoula, Montana, and has been there for 5 years. Debbie is very interested in working with people to find workable solutions to tough natural resource issues. She is a strong proponent of collaborative processes and has seen great benefits from it to both land and people. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's always interesting following a professor when you're giving a talk, somebody who actually lectures for a living, but I'll give it my best shot. I'd like to start by saying I'm really glad to be here, and hopefully I'll have some things to say that will be of interest to you. To start with, I would like to say I don't think we're doing any squirrely stuff in Montana, but I guess we can talk about that later. There's a lot of confusion about the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, the Healthy Forest Initiative, the National Fire Plan, and all the new things that have been happening in the last few years. So I will try to clarify that. It's not very simple, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. Following the 2000 fire season and several reports from GAO, the General Accounting Office, and other things, a national fire plan amongst the land management agencies was developed. And the main goal of the National Fire Plan was to maintain and restore fire-adapted ecosystems. And one of the big changes, I think, that precipitated that, besides just the large catastrophic fire seasons, wasn't just the change in the vegetation, but the change in where people were living. Over the last 20 plus years or so, there's been a mass sort of exodus out of the urban centers into the forest. And people like trees, they like living amongst the trees. And this has caused a pretty difficult problem now with the change in the ecosystems and now houses being present. How are we going to deal with all of those things together? So the National Fire Plan was established, and from that came a 10-year comprehensive strategy that basically was agreed to by all of the federal land management agencies. And the key points within that were to improve fire prevention and fire suppression, to reduce hazardous fuels, to restore fire-adapted ecosystems and rebuild communities, and also to promote community assistance to help communities help themselves. That went on for a while, and it was pretty quickly noted that there were a lot of barriers to implementation of the National Fire Plan. The agencies weren't able to take the money that was appropriated from Congress and actually get work done on the ground. Because of that, the Bush administration developed and created the Healthy Forest Initiative. So it came out of the National Fire Plan. Both of those things were administrative things that were put together sort of to help the agencies get work done. The intent of the Healthy Forest Initiative was to identify and remove these barriers to implementation of the National Fire Plan, and again, restore and maintain fire-adapted ecosystems. From the Healthy Forest Initiative came several tools, some of which were administrative tools and some of which were legislative tools. And again, this was the intent of Congress and the legislative solutions, and the intent of the administration and the administrative was to allow the agencies to actually get work done on the ground and start making a difference, primarily in the wildland-urban interface. Some of these new authorities, some of the administrative ones, was the new authority for categorical exclusions. And what that is, for those of you who don't understand the National Environmental Policy Act and the, quote, NEPA process, there's 3 levels of analysis, the highest being the EIS, or Environmental Impact Statement, the next being the environmental assessment, and then the lower level of analysis is what's called a categorical exclusion. And recently, the Forest Service was granted the authority to use categorical exclusions for things like post-fire restoration, small thinning of green trees, small salvages, salvage projects, and insect and disease, removal of insect and disease infected trees. So that was one of the administrative things. There were 2 legislative things that also came about in an effort to help the agencies implement the National Fire Plan, one of which was the Permanent Authority of Stewardship Contracting, which is a tool that allows work to be done on the ground instead of the agencies having a timber sale, selling the timber and the money goes back to Congress or to the Treasury. Those funds can be used to do restoration work, whether it be road work or water quality, fish habitat, all those sorts of things. So the money actually stays on the ground in the area that it was where the vegetation was managed. And then the next one, which I'll spend a little bit more time talking about, is the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And that was passed, as was just said just recently. And it was really, I think, to me, one of the strongest messages that sort of the nation as a whole has come forward with in terms of management of their national forests and public lands. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act was passed by 8 out of every 10 senators and 2 out of every 3 members in Congress. So it was very bipartisan. It enjoyed more support than just about any legislation, certainly any environmental legislation, but also other kinds of legislation. And it was a real message, I think, that people wanted to do something. And it certainly, I think, had a lot of push because of the big wildfires that occurred in 2003. The primary purpose of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act is to reduce wildfire risk to communities, municipal water supplies, and other at-risk federal land through a collaborative process of planning, prioritizing, and implementing hazardous fuel reduction projects. It also includes a couple of sections, which I won't go into great detail, excuse me, on the use of biomass, particularly for fuels. And that's basically you take out all those extra 3,000 trees per acre that are existing. What do you do with them? There's lots of different options, but one of the things the Act is authorizing is additional research and assistance to small businesses on the ability to use that biomass, particularly in fuel generation. Another is to identify the impact that insect and disease is having and to be able to detect insect and disease problems sooner than going out and flying and seeing the needles are already red. So it's trying to get a jump on where future problems might occur. It also talks about improving T&E, or threatened endangered species habitat, improving biodiversity and productivity of the land. So there's a whole bunch of things in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. It focuses in the wildland-urban interface, and there are some definitions, specific definitions of that. Basically, it's within a half a mile of a development, a community, a group of houses, or municipal watersheds. It can go up to 1.5 miles away from those areas if certain circumstances exist, such as slope topography and that sort of thing. So it's really focusing again on maintaining and restoring those ecosystems with the intent of protecting or being able to better protect communities. It also focuses, one of the things that Ron was talking about was the systems that are, we call it out of whack, the systems that aren't functioning the way they've functioned historically. And it's broken out in the Act and in the science into condition classes. And so the vegetation, you can be condition class, it goes 1 through 3, 3 being the most out of sync with where it has been historically. And what those condition classes are, the condition classes 2 and 3 are, is where the fire regimes have been altered, where the fires come a lot less frequently and either a lot more catastrophic, or something's just broken with the way the systems have worked naturally. It also includes the risk of losing key ecosystems due to fire. Again, here in Montana, we have a very limited number of white bark pine stands. They're sort of on the way out. We don't want to have those lost in catastrophic wildfires. And where the vegetation, again, is altered from where it's been naturally. So the focus of the Act, again, is in the urban interface, in those areas where fire is not playing the role that fire has naturally played. It also focuses on collaboration and community involvement. A big part of the Act talks about community fire plans, and I'll get into how that fits in a minute. But it's just interesting that the last couple of laws that have been passed, environmental laws that have been passed, all include talk about collaborative process and working with communities, the agencies and communities and interested people working together. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act also changed the requirements for analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. And I know that, excuse me, has a lot of people concerned. I guess I don't really see it that way so much, and let me just explain the changes as I see them. It really depends, again, if you're in the wildland-urban interface or not. If you're not in the wildland-urban interface, you're still required to go through an analysis and look at an alternative to what you're proposing to do. And you're required to look at what happens if you don't do anything. So outside of the wildland-urban interface, that part of the analysis really hasn't changed. If you are in the urban interface and your community has a fire plan, and the community fire plans are plans that are put together with the community members and with resource managers and a lot of times scientists to try to figure out where are our problems, where are the most significant risks of a catastrophic wildfire affecting communities. And those plans are put together, and if you have one of those plans and you're working on a project within the wildland-urban interface, the requirements for analysis are much smaller. You're required to analyze an alternative that community fire plan spells out. and that's the only alternative. You're also not required to analyze what happens if you don't do anything. There's also one in the middle. If you're in the wildland-urban interface and you don't have a community fire plan, then you're required to look at 2 alternatives. Currently in NEPA, the law requires to look at a wide range of alternatives. And so normally there's anywhere from, I would say, 3 to 6 in most environmental analyses. So it shrinks that down again. And then again, this was an effort to sort of streamline and remove some barriers and spend more of the limited resources getting things done on the ground in communities in a more timely manner. The other thing it did, one of the other things it did is that it replaced our appeal process with a pre-decisional review process. And what that means is in the normal NEPA process, or normal, it's okay if I say NEPA, which is National Environmental Policy Act, I think it's almost become a word. In our current NEPA process, a decision is made. If somebody doesn't like it, they appeal it. It goes through appeal review. If it's either remanded, the decision goes back for further analysis, or it's implemented, or it gets litigated, or whatever happens. Under this new process, if you have been involved in the development of the project and you still don't like it, before the decision is made, you have an opportunity to ask for review. And so it's a little bit different than the process that we have. There is still administrative remedy if you don't like the project, but again, it's pre-decisional, which is different than our other processes. Another thing that it does spell out pretty specifically is some direction to the judicial branch, or the judges. And the things that are different between projects that are done under this authority and our other authorities, if somebody is interested in litigating a project under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, they must do so in the court. It has jurisdiction where the project exists geographically. So if it's somewhere in Montana, it's going to be in Montana District Court or the Ninth Circuit for appeals. You don't have the option to move around to different district courts to look for litigation. It also requires the judge to expedite the review to their best ability to do that. It limits them to a 60-day injunction on the project. That can be extended, but it could only be extended if the parties come in and give additional information and talk about what's happening by stalling the project. And it also directs the judges to balance short-term and long-term effects of implementing the project and not implementing the project, which is very, very different than existing direction or existing judicial review. And I'll give you an example, and it's not, I won't use a fuels example, but for example, to do fish habitat work, if we want to go in and improve a culvert because the fish can't get through, to take that old culvert out and put a new one in puts a lot of sediment in the creek. So when you look at legally, when you look at what's happening, that project has an adverse effect to fish. But the long-term effect is much more beneficial than the short-term negative impact. And that's what the law is trying to get the judges to look at in terms of fuels. If you don't do anything, is the long-term effect worse or not? Don't just look at the short-term effects. It also includes some other provisions, just sort of other information. We're not allowed to implement any projects in wilderness study areas. It talks about treating primarily small diameter trees, and I know you talked about that works in some systems and doesn't work in other systems. I'm sure through the politics of all of this, that was one of the provisions that was included so that everybody could buy into it. And here in Montana, it does work pretty well for us, particularly in those low elevation ponderosa pine stands, which is coincidentally where a lot of our urban interface is. So I think for us, this bill works very, very well in terms of what it allows us to do. It also has some interesting provisions on monitoring and adapting. It talks about specific requirements for monitoring the results of these projects. It talks about if there's interest in a community to do what's called multi-party monitoring, where we have people from outside the agency monitor what we're doing. That provision is there. And then it requires us to adapt future projects based on what we learn from that monitoring. So it's pretty specific, and again, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act is just one tool under the Healthy Forest Initiative that's helping to implement the overall National Fire Plan. So just a couple other quick things before work that's being done under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act is money that's being done with our existing budgets. There's talk in the future budgets of increasing our appropriation. But again, when you hear the $760 million, that's just the authorization for them to give it to us. It's not the money. So with that, I would just like to say that there's a lot of fear about the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. In my mind, it's just a tool that helps us work with communities who really are at risk. There are a lot of communities, I mean, just look out the window here, that are at risk of catastrophic wildfire. And if this act can help us allow our firefighters to be even a little bit more effective, I think it's a pretty good thing to do. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer questions when everybody's done.
Thank you. All right, I hope you guys all have an understanding of what the Healthy Forest Initiative is, how it works. Now we're going to move on and talk about some of the economic issues underlying the Healthy Forest Initiative and logging. So our next speaker will be Professor Tom Power. Professor Power is currently the professor of the economics and chairman of the economics department at the University of Montana. He specializes in natural resource and regional economic development issues. Professor Power received his undergraduate degree in physics at Lehigh University. He did his graduate work at Princeton University. He received his master's and doctorate from Princeton in economics. Professor Power has taught at Princeton, Lehigh, and at the University of Montana, where he has been since 1968. He has been chairman of the economics department since 1978. Professor Power's most recent book, Post-Cowboy Economics, Pay and Prosperity in the New American West, was published in the summer of 2001. He has also written 4 other books and is currently working on his 6th book. Professor Power regularly testifies before state and federal regulatory agencies on energy policy, natural resource development, environmental protection, and local economic development. So I open up the floor to Tom Power. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm so old that I have the privilege or the right to sort of deviate from the script. And I want to provide some background as to why I think the Healthy Forest Initiative has proved to be so controversial and has generated so much heat. I think to understand that, one has to look back over the last 50 years or so of forest management in the western United States. Then I will turn to say something about, at least my view as an economist, of some of the issues, some of the controversies associated with what has been described as a one-size-fits-all approach that seems to be buried in the Healthy Forest Initiative. The Forest Service, for the first half of its existence, primarily engaged in custodial management of the western forests. It was only after the end of the Second World War, period starting in about 1950, stretching, I would say, until about 1990, that the Forest Service launched a very active and aggressive timber sales program in this region. In carrying out that program, I think it's fair to say that the Forest Service was infected by what Paul Hurt called a conspiracy of optimism. The Forest Service was so sure it knew exactly what it was doing and what the land was capable of supporting that it thought it could pursue all of the multiple objectives that the law laid out as legitimate objectives for public lands. It could carry them out all more or less simultaneously for some land managers, simultaneously on the same acre of land. That there were no trade-offs, there were no difficult choices that had to be made. The result was what one other author has labeled a multiple-use clear-cut. That huge clear cuts, and I, in my youth, you fought fires, I planted trees. And in North Idaho, there were places where you couldn't even take in the size of the clear cut by turning your head. You had to turn your body to sweep across huge, hundreds and hundreds of clear-cut acres. Those clear cuts, we were told by forest scientists, would increase the production of water. They would improve wildlife habitat and modern language, would add to biodiversity. They would improve recreation, primarily by providing roaded access to those what had been forested lands. They would improve scenic diversity, if not scenic beauty. They would provide for community stability. And they would help bring down the cost of housing because the Forest Service was flooding markets with publicly supported timber harvests and did have an impact in reducing the cost of building materials and helping Americans following the Great Depression and World War II pursue the dream of owning their own home. So multiple use, what later got characterized as wise use, was something that was seen as possible on all of these lands. We just didn't have to make difficult economic choices or difficult choices, period. Now, in retrospect, I think one could argue, and the Forest Service for a brief 10-year period, 1990 to relatively recently, felt that there had been a conspiracy of optimism, that there was serious environmental damage being done to fisheries, to wildlife habitat, especially for certain endangered species, that scenic beauty was certainly being damaged, recreational opportunities, and that in fact choices had to be made, that we couldn't do everything simultaneously. We had to make judgments, we had to make choices, and that if we didn't, there'd be serious costs, not necessarily monetary costs, but certainly environmental costs, cost to what our forests would be capable of producing in the future. I lay that out because since the decline in timber harvests off of our Forest Service lands, beginning really in 1988, there's been strong pressure by timber interests, political interests to get the harvest off of our public lands up to the level that it used to be. The push to control wildfires, including the Healthy Forest Initiative, proposes, at least in some folks' minds, landscape scale, mechanical, vegetative manipulation, including timber harvests, as ways of producing multiple good things again. That mechanical treatment over broad aspects of our landscape, our forested landscape, not only will save us from fire, it will improve the health of the forest, it will bring all sorts of positive environmental aspects. It will provide economic boost to our communities, again, and will allow us to increase the flow of commercially valuable fiber to regional mills. All of that while simultaneously saving us from catastrophic wildfires. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that some of the optimism that was scientifically based, we were told, in the previous 40 or 50 years, we find that same optimism now about what we know and what we can do, confidence in the results. I see very little humility, very little caution, nothing that's very conservative in the conservation sense. I think it's important to recall how we got in the situation we're currently in. And I'm not, the forest scientists include economists, so when I'm talking about forest scientists, I'm not picking on Ron, I'm picking on myself and my colleagues in the social science side of things too. Part of the bind we're in now, in terms of fuel loads and the threat of catastrophic wildfires, is tied to the fact that is tied to past human activity manipulating that landscape. It's tied to grazing, as Ron mentioned, which reduced the fine fuels, allowed woody vegetation later to become ladder fuels, guaranteeing a hotter burn when there was fire. It was tied to timber harvest that removed the overstory and released the understory and very thick, packed, dense regrowth. It was tied to fire suppression aimed at protecting commercially valuable timber resources. The forest scientists who we now are going to rely on to save us from wildfires are the forest scientists in previous generations that helped create the problem that we currently face. Now, that's not an attack on them. I'm raising the issue to try and underline why some folks, I think appropriately, are skeptical and cautious about whether this time we know what we're doing. Whether we know what we're doing well enough that we can do it on a landscape scale, on an epic scale, to try and transform the entire forested landscape in the western United States. Now, a lot of people say that's not what we're trying to do, but some of the folks who are talking about problems of wildfire control are not just talking about the urban-wildland interface. They stretch it out into the watersheds. Then they stretch it further than that to talk about other valuable forest resources. Some are also talking about what we need to do within wilderness, not in terms of commercial harvest, but in terms of vegetative manipulation, literally across the landscape. So one of my points here is an appeal for caution, to recognize that we got it wrong in the recent past. One of the things we should know for certain is we will get it wrong again. That doesn't mean we don't do anything, but it does mean that we should be cautious about what we do. And that leads into some economics here. Landscape-wide forest fuel control or management would be incredibly costly, incredibly expensive. Now, there's some conflicting data on that, but in fact, one has to remove, one can't do the squirrely things that are being done in California. You can't just remove a large number of the trees and leave all the slash on the ground. You can't then just walk away and think the forest will take care of itself. It involves removing huge volume of non-commercial, no commercial value associated with the fiber. It also includes going back regularly to maintain that condition. That's going to be incredibly costly, and some would argue, I think, quite invasive if it's done on a landscape basis. In the current federal deficit situation, we don't know if any of the money already authorized for this particular act is actually going to be appropriated. Whether the funds that would be needed for the grand scale that some folks are talking about would ever be appropriated is very, very doubtful. That means, the reason I'm emphasizing that is that if Congress will not put up the dollars, then we have to find some other way of finding the money to engage in this vegetative manipulation. The most obvious way of finding that money is to harvest commercially valuable trees and use the money associated with those trees to fund the removal of the non-commercial fiber. Now, that would be fine if it were true that what was optimal for commercial timber harvest was also optimal for forest health and forest fuels reduction. My understanding, and I'm not forest fuel specialist, but my understanding is that those two don't always coincide. That logging is not the equivalent of fuel reduction. That what's called for in terms of managing land for commercial purposes requires behavior and the removal of types of tree that are quite different than what one would pursue if one was focused on forest restoration or focused primarily on fuel reduction. That's just a warning that we have potentially two conflicting objectives. We want to harvest trees to generate money so that we can use that money for forest restoration. Those may be in serious conflict, and that's why I emphasized the conspiracy of optimism at the beginning. If we act as if there's no conflict between those two and that there's no trade-off between those two, we're going back to the sloppy, lazy habits of thought that got us partly into the corner that we're in now. We have to face up to the fact that we often are going to face trade-offs. We're going to often face very high costs if we want to do this and do it right. And finally, speaking in terms of doing it right, I think we could build a consensus. We'll see in a minute here. I think we could build a consensus if the description we got of the Healthy Forest Initiative was the whole story. If in fact we focused, and in getting the Healthy Forest Initiative passed, there was long and bitter debate over to what extent this act would in fact be focused on the wildland-urban interface. If we were to focus our activities, initially especially with the limited resources we have, on those landscapes that are already human-dominated because they're where we live, if the focus initially was there, which is appropriate because that's the priority area, that's the first thing the Forest Service is supposed to be trying to do, and that's to protect people and property and communities. If we were to focus there, focus our efforts there, a good deal of the controversy about going into the high country or the back country under the guise of fuel controls would evaporate. Unfortunately, there are some folks who supported the Healthy Forest Initiative who intend to try and use that to justify activities at far removed from the urban wildland interface. If we stayed focused where people lived on those human-dominated landscapes, at least for the time being, we have more than enough work to do there. I think the thing to do besides just focusing on changing the vegetation is an incredibly important need to focus on a coordinated, proactive policies that bring it not only our public land managers, but local firefighting organizations and our insurance companies into the battle. We know that the primary way to protect people and property is to change two things about people's habitations. One is the upkeep and the building materials that are used, and the second is to carefully manage the lot, the yard, and the first 100 feet or 100 yards around those habitations. That with proper management of those, we can assure that for most fires, the habitations will survive the wildfires. The second thing, and let me just throw this out as an example because I'm running out of time here, is to find a way of providing incentives for those folks who are choosing to live on the urban wildland interface to take responsibility for their own safety and the safety of their property. There's something not right seeing 100 people and a dozen fire engines and pumps standing ready to defend somebody's trophy home in the mountains. Having an incredible amount of public funds and people's lives put at risk, especially in those habitations where people haven't taken the basic steps to protect themselves. If we're going to pass federal legislation, I would propose federal legislation that indicated, number one, wildfire is a natural event, very controversial. Number two, the federal government's not responsible if wildfire moves from public lands to private lands, if it's a wildfire, unless one can show that in some sense the federal agency was negligent. The legislation should say that homeowners and insurance companies should not be able to bring claims against the federal government if those seeking to be reimbursed for their lost homes can't demonstrate that they, before the fire, had met all of the standards required to have a fire-safe home in a forest setting. If we were to do that, and that we would find very quickly that insurance companies, and that's happening in parts of the West already, insurance companies and local fire fighting agencies, I'm not talking about the Forest Service, I'm talking about rural fire departments and city fire departments, would begin to put a significant pressure on those who seek to live in the forest to change the way in which they lived in the forest, so that natural wildfires did not represent the threat to property and lives that they currently do. If we start where the priority areas are now, show that we can do a good job there, I think the Forest Service will be laying the basis for developing the confidence among all of the citizens that it knows what it's doing, that this time it's being cautious and humble in its approach, and that we can safely take the next step in terms of trying to restore some of the forests that are badly beyond historical conditions. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about some environmental issues associated with the Healthy Forest Initiative. Our final panelist tonight is Matthew Kaler from the Native Forest Network. Matthew Kaler is the campaign coordinator for the Native Forest Network, a nonprofit environmental organization based in Missoula, whose mission is to protect and restore forests and wild places. He is a co-founder of the National Forest Protection Alliance, which today is a national grassroots coalition of 130 environmental groups from around the country working to protect America's national forests. Matthew was born and raised in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, a village of 1,000 people surrounded by the Kettle Moraine State Forest. In addition to being a certified high school English and history teacher, he paid his way through college by working at his cousin's lumber company in Wisconsin and spent a summer as a wildland firefighter in Oregon. So Matthew?
Yeah, I think we're all walking out.
All right, since I only have 20 minutes to talk about really what is not only the Healthy Forest Initiative, but I think it's been explained pretty well so far. Really, we're talking about forest policy under the Bush administration, which components of that are the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Other components of that have just been really put under the catchphrase of the Healthy Forest Initiative. So I'm going to do my second ever PowerPoint presentation here, and we're going to see how it works. So the Healthy Forest Initiative, what we feel it does and does not do is it does not effectively protect homes from wildfire. The reason we feel it doesn't effectively protect homes from wildfire is, as you can see, according to the Forest Service, Only 92% of the land that's presenting a risk to communities is non-federal land. Yet the bill, and if Congress would ever authorize funding for the bill, which was talked about earlier, the bill only focuses on federal land, which again is about 8% of the problem. We're going to get into the issue of home protection a little bit later, but U.S. Forest Service researchers here in Missoula at the Fire Science Lab have found that the most effective way you protect a home from wildfire is to focus on the home ignition zone, which is the home itself and the area within 200 feet of the home. We feel as if the Healthy Forests Initiative severely limits public participation. Really what we're hearing, really when the Bush administration was put in power, and we saw them select Mark Ray as Undersecretary of Agriculture, former logging industry lobbyist, and Dale Bosworth, who was formerly here in Montana, to be chief of the Forest Service. The new mantra of the Forest Service seemed to be analysis paralysis. And to be quite honest, we heard some of that talk a little bit earlier, that some of these projects are being barred. Well, the General Accounting Office has looked into this issue 4 times now. Their most recent report, which came out days before the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was passed, found that of 818 Forest Service fuel reduction projects, 97% went forward without litigation, 95% went forward within the standard 90-day review study. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act, despite what Senator Baucus and Senator Wyden from Oregon say, it does not protect ancient old-growth forests. It does allow some protection for ancient old-growth forests, but it doesn't protect ancient old-growth forests in cases of epidemics of disease or insects, and in cases of wind throw, blowdown, or ice storms. And anyone who's been in an ancient old-growth forest, just spent some time out in Oregon myself, you know that ice storms, wind throw, blowdown are all an essential natural part of a healthy ancient forest. The bill also does not protect roadless areas from commercial logging that are done under the guise of fuel reduction. As was kind of alluded to, we really just need to look at the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, the piece of legislation that was passed. I like to say it's one piece of the Healthy Forest Initiative pie. Some of the other things that the Bush administration is doing, and we like to call these forest protection rollbacks, not to be confused with the rollbacks you might find at Walmart. It was mentioned, categorical exclusions were mentioned earlier. It allows the Forest Service to conduct an unlimited number of logging projects to proceed across the national forest with limited environmental analysis and no public appeals process. You can see the parameters around that: 70 acres of green trees, 250 post-fire salvage, and 1,000 acres of fuel reduction. We mentioned the squirrely stuff happening in Region 5, which is where the Sierra Nevada forests are in California. The Forest Service has scrapped, well, the Bush administration has really scrapped the original Sierra Nevada framework, which was put together following 8 years of study. Their new Sierra Nevada framework, which they're now calling Forest with a Future, they hired a PR firm that spent, the Forest Service spent $113,000 hiring a PR firm to put together the messaging on this. It triples logging levels on 11 national forests in California, opens spotted owl reserves to logging, and allows logging of trees nearly 8 feet in circumference under the guise of fuel reduction. The Tongass National Forest, the biggest national forest in the country at over 17 million acres. It's obviously in Alaska, one of the largest temperate rainforests remaining in the world. The Forest Service under Mark Ray has dropped the Tongass from the roadless rule, also dropped the Chugach National Forest from the roadless rule. What does that mean on the Tongass? We're seeing 50 ancient forest timber sales now on the chopping block. We're seeing that affects almost 1/3 of a million acres. There is currently a lawsuit that does seek to stop 9 of the timber sales that were to proceed this summer. Just those timber sales would log enough old-growth trees from roadless areas to fill almost 50,000 log trucks, which, if lined up end-to-end, would stretch for over 400 miles. Some of the other rollbacks of the Bush administration, they've dropped Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for any fuel reduction projects. This, ironically, was announced the same day that the Bush administration was, that President Bush was signing the Healthy Forest Restoration Act into law, so it really didn't get a lot of media attention. Just about 2 weeks ago, they dropped 144 species from protections under the Northwest Forest Plan. They no longer have to do survey and manage provisions for 144 species. They're in the process of gutting the National Forest Management Act, and they're in the process of rewriting the roadless rule. One thing I think we need to do, because so much of the bush forest policy is being done under the guise of the fire hysteria, fear of fires, let's put fire into perspective. Since 2000, an average of 5.5 million acres has burned. That's only 40% of the average of almost 14 million acres during a lot of the past century. Our recent wildfire season's the worst ever. I believe 2000 is still tops, maybe 2002, but the worst that we've seen in the past 4 years is about 8 million acres burned. Well, during the 30s, we saw 50 million acres burned per year in 1930 and 31. And during this decade, from the mid-20s to the late 20s to the late 30s, 30 million acres burned annually. We also need to remember that since 2000, a third of the acres that have burned either in Alaska, where if you talk with firefighters up there, they customarily will light 20, 30, 40,000 acre back burns up there. But a lot of the fires have burned in Alaska, which is burning in primarily patchy, stunted forests and tundra. And then a lot of the fires have occurred east of the Mississippi too. We don't think of areas in the southeast, such as Florida and Georgia, as having natural fires, but they definitely do. And in some cases, Florida, we will even have more acres burned than we do here in the Northern Rockies. So we often hear the term catastrophic fires. These fires are catastrophic, they're unnatural, they destroy everything in their path. One of my most favorite examples from that was last year when President Bush went to talk about the Healthy Forests Initiative just before he raised a few $1 million at a campaign stop up in Portland, Oregon. But he was in Oregon, and they had the B&B fire that just started in Oregon on the Deschutes National Forest. And he toured the forest. He came back and said, it's the Holocaust, it's devastating. Well, the Forest Service did research after the fire, found that 90% of the fire area was either unburned or burned at low to moderate intensity. We see this happening on the Biscuit Fire in southern Oregon as well, southwestern Oregon. In fact, this is the area where President Bush announced the Healthy Forest Initiative back in the year 2002. This area burned in 2002. 84% of the fire area either burned at low to moderate intensity or did not burn at all. Unfortunately, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, this area right here is an inventoried roadless area that is targeted for salvage logging under what is the largest logging project in U.S. Forest Service history. What did burn very intensely in a lot of parts of the Biscuit Fire was the previously logged and roaded areas. Here's a pine plantation, or maybe a Doug fir plantation that torched pretty good. Another thing that we hear is we need to reduce fuels across the forest to protect homes. And I alluded to this earlier, Jack Cohen here at the Fire Science Lab here in Missoula. It's very clear that if you want to protect homes, your home from wildfire, you need to focus on the home itself, as Dr. Power talked about, what it's built out of, what the roof is constructed out of, and the area within 200 feet of the home. And time and again, you see this work. This is from the Bitterroot National Forest, or the Bitterroot fires of 2000. Here, a homeowner has kept a tidy lawn. You don't need to have the area of 200 feet around your home completely devoid of vegetation. If anyone is interested in Dr. Cohen's work, he has, through the Forest Service, produced an amazing video, DVD in this case, Wildfire Preventing Home Ignitions, where he's basically kind of a CSI Forest Service type person. He goes out into the areas and kind of studies, well, this home burned, this home survived, what were the reasons? Was it a crown fire? Was it a ground fire? One of the other things that we hear as a justification for the Healthy Forest Initiative is that commercial logging can reduce fire risk. This is a recent study from a community forestry group out of the Southwest, the Forest Trust, and you can see what they were saying here. The proposal that commercial logging can reduce the incidence of canopy fire was untested. And one of the reasons for that is obviously because commercial logging As Dr. Power was talking about this sort of conflict of interest, commercial logging typically targets the large fire-resistant trees, when if you're going to protect, if you're going to reduce fuels, you want to focus typically on the smaller diameter, really saplings and underbrush. You might have seen this picture recently. It's in the Missoulian just the other day. It is the Lick Creek area of the Bitterroot National Forest. The PR firm must have missed it because it is in this slick little publication. This photo continues to be used by the Forest Service, even here in Montana. You can go down to the Bitterroot Supervisor's office tomorrow and pick up a pamphlet that has this photo. This photo has repeatedly been used by the Forest Service, continues to be used by the Forest Service to show historic forest conditions, despite the fact that if you look very closely, you're seeing slash piles and stumps throughout the forest. This was actually the cleanup operations on the Lick Creek timber sale, which was one of the early timber sales on the Bitterroot National Forest back in 1909. This is a photo of the same area, not the same exact area before logging, but this is typical of what that forest looked like. This is the Forest Service's sort of model fuel reduction project, at least according to Dale Bosworth. Dale Bosworth toured the Fort Valley timber sale. This is on the Coconino National Forest outside of Flagstaff. And he said, this is the type of thinning that we need to do over 40 million acres across the West. We just feel as if this is a bit extreme. It's a commercial timber sale program. I'm not sure. They probably have effectively reduced fuels, but I'm not sure if they've really left the forest. And this is one of the reasons. This is an old growth sale from Idaho from a few years back. Again, commercial logging removes the least flammable portion of the tree, its trunk. What does it leave on the ground? It leaves a lot of logging slash, the branches and needles. Commercial logging for post-fire restoration. This seems to be one of the favorite ones. Salvage logging, we hear it. Salvage sounds good. You want to go up into your grandma's attic, salvage something from the attic. You want to go salvage something from the landfill. It has a good connotation. In fact, half of the Forest Service's timber sale volume right now is coming from post-fire salvage logging. As you can see there, the scientific data is clearly pointing that really it's an economic endeavor, not an ecological endeavor. We have some before and after shots here on the Kootenai National Forest. Before, after salvage logging. See that again. Before, after. We have another one. Before, after. This is not restoration. There's just no other way to look at it. So now we move to the Bitterroot. And everybody who was around here during 2000 remembers the wildfires of 2000. And down on the Bitterroot National Forest, the Forest Service proposed what, at the time, before the Biscuit Fire, which we'll get to in a second, was one of the largest logging projects in Forest Service history. They told us they needed to get down there. They wanted to circumvent the public appeals process so that they could get down there and begin with restoration. Here's another quote from Dale Bosworth. Most important thing to me is getting on with the restoration work. There's a lot of work we want to do, roads we want to obliterate, watershed work, reforestation. The whole idea of the project was fire restoration. A week following the controversial settlement on the Bitterroot, this is what was found out in the forest. Clearly large diameter trees. Sap is a pretty good indication of a live tree. Those trees seem barely burned. This is one of the stewardship projects on the Bitterroot. We have some concerns with the stewardship provisions that were mentioned earlier that we can maybe talk about in the question and answer. These are all shots from the Bitterroot Burned Area Recovery Plan. Here's the supervisor of the Bitterroot National Forest, Dave Bull, defending his plan. What we see happening on the Bitterroot, we see two things. They're logging all the large trees. You can see they cut the large pondo there, not doing anything with those. What are they leaving on the ground? A lot of logging slash. The Bitterroot, in their analysis, even admitted they were increasing fire risk for up to the next 8 years on the Bitterroot. Here's another example. Again, burned area recovery. Once we went up into this area, we were told, yes, it wasn't burned, but it was insect infestation. But all the green needles are a pretty good sign that insects weren't in the area. And you can see they're clearly taking all the big trees. We might know why, the reason that they're doing that. The green tree sale, this is actually what we saw with somebody out there shoring. We followed this log truck through downtown Hamilton, and anyone who's been in Missoula the past couple years has seen log trucks like this rolling down from the Bitterroot. One of the things that we're most concerned about on the Bitterroot is, right, the whole idea of the project was restoration. Well, now we're 2 years into the project, and only 17% of the restoration work, the road and watershed restoration work, has been done, and over $15 million that was set aside for restoration work is gone because it was to pay for the 2002 wildfire season. Here's a slide showing sedimentation going into the North Fork of Rye Creek. This is further on down there. It's interesting to note, we just found out a month ago that the North Fork of Rye Creek flows right into Rye Creek. The latest survey of bull trout on Rye Creek, which historically was one of the bull trout strongholds in the Bitterroot, the Forest Service's recent survey turned up 0 bull trout in Rye Creek. Just another example, the road restoration work is not getting done. Avoidable damage could be avoided here, but they're simply pushing forward with the logging. The restoration, the rhetoric and the on-the-ground reality are just not matching up on the Bitterroot. You'd think they learned their lesson on the Bitterroot. Following the Biscuit Fire in Oregon, they're planning a timber sale, which is a 518 million board foot timber sale. That's enough trees to be lined up on log trucks end to end from Vancouver, Canada to Tijuana, Mexico. Again, post-fire restoration is what they're calling it. This is what they're after. You can see blue means cut. They're already doing logging on the Biscuit. These are 2 big guys. Joseph here is about 6 foot. This is on the Lolo National Forest. And again, I'm not, you know, I only have 20 minutes, so hopefully in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about some other things. But again, it's very hard to trust the Forest Service. It's very hard to trust the administration when we see them saying one thing, and then we go out into the woods, and whether it's on the Biscuit or on the Bitterroot, we see something different happening. This is an area that was burned in the Mineral Prim Fire just last year in the Rattlesnake Wilderness area, and then it burned a lot into the lands owned by Plum Creek in the Gold Creek drainage. This is along the West Fork Gold Creek Trail. It's a trail that leads directly into the Rattlesnake Wilderness. This is within 500 feet of the wilderness boundary. This is also Unit 1 of a categorical exclusion timber sale that the Forest Service has proposed. It's a salvage timber sale. You can see a lot of green vegetation there. It was announced during Christmas of this past year. And for the skiers in the room, you can remember there was a lot of snow during that time. When it was announced, this area is probably under 6 or 7 feet of snow. We actually did this tour. We happened to do this tour before it was a timber sale in October. With the EAC. This is some of the stuff that the EAC does. Again, this is within Unit 1 of this logging project, adjacent to the Rattlesnake Wilderness area, within 500 feet, adjacent to a roadless area. Again, this is within Unit 1. Again, this is what we see when we go out on the ground. This is what the Plum Creek land, where we were was kind of up in here. This is looking down Gold Creek. This is what the Plum Creek land looks like. Thinning and road building and fuel reduction and logging could stop forest fires. Wonder why Plum Creek land looks like this. Firefighters who are fighting this fire dubbed it the Black Desert. This is some of the other stuff that we see happening under the Bush administration's watch. These are all current logging projects. This is the East Rim timber sale on the Kaibab National Forest down in Arizona. Blue means cut. 95% of the trees in the Southwest are under 12 inches in diameter. These are enormous trees in a dispersed camping area, 48 miles from the nearest community. It's being done under the guise of fuel reduction and community protection. 2 minutes. This is the Jigsaw timber sale on the Umpqua National Forest. Junk Rock timber sale, Mount Hood National Forest. Insect infestation, they say. Blue means cut. Lemelo timber sale on the Umpqua again. Pig Out timber sale again on the Umpqua. Blue means cut. Winberry timber sale on the Willamette. This is the Berry Patch timber sale before. Berry Patch timber sale after. Clark timber sale, Willamette National Forest. Thankfully under litigation right now. Kelsey Whiskey timber sale, largest roadless area on Bureau of Land Management lands in Oregon. That's a view from above. That's what it looks like on the ground. This sale goes to auction on May 27th of this year. We expect 1,000 people to be at the auction protesting it. This is the Coquille timber sale on the Coos Bay district of the BLM in Oregon. Mr. Wilson timber sale, Medford BLM in Oregon again. Some of you might remember we brought this tree to Missoula last year, 440-year-old tree, cut down under the Bush administration's watch. How can we believe that they really want to protect our forest, restore our forest, when the same agency that is telling us that are the same agencies that are out there doing this? You know, when you talk about trust and collaboration, let's stay out of the roadless areas. Let's stop logging the old growth forest. And then maybe we can sit down and start to work together and start to trust each other a little bit. But when it comes to the Forest Service, and I just got this today and I put it up and we're gonna send it to Mark Ray because I think he'll like it too. But when it comes to the Forest Service, and this is Mark Ray, just the head. It's hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. That seems to be the mantra. I think I am probably out of time. Maybe in the Q&A we can talk about some of our vision for national forest protection and restoration. Vision that includes protecting and restoring watersheds, removing roads. The Forest Service has 440,000 miles of roads on our national forest. The Healthy Forest Restoration Act doesn't deal with roads at all. We got to deal with protecting our ancient old growth forest. Imperiled wildlife, 421 species of wildlife that call national forest home require protections under the ESA. Clearly, we have to deal with returning fire's natural and beneficial role to our forests while we protect communities and invasive species. Obviously not on national forest land. Those of you here in Missoula can see the L. But we have a lot of work doing in removing and reducing the incident of insect infestation and exotic species on our national forests. So look forward to hearing a good lively talk in the Q&A section, and thank you very much.
Okay, I'll get the lights. All right.
Well, I think this is a good time to open it up. David and Elizabeth just asked me as a moderator if I could just request that people be courteous and polite and try not to take too much time and try to keep your comments brief if you have comments and focus most of all on questions, I think. And I think everyone was just worried about one or two people trying to appropriate the rest of everybody's time. So if we could just try to be as courteous as possible, stick to the point, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion and debate. And we'll just, if you have a question, raise your hand.
I'd like to direct the question to Debbie, although Tom may want to chime in given some of the things he said. You pointed out that it's increasingly hard for the Forest Service to manage fire ecologically as people or as the suburbs are swerving up into the fire-prone zones. In 1993, after the big Mississippi River fire, the upper echelons of the Army Corps of Engineers finally started listening to their scientists who have been telling them for years, we can stop the little floods, but we can't control the big floods. And it's probably just a lot smarter from an ecological, from an economic, and from a public safety standpoint to buy up land in the floodplain and move people out of the floodplain. Then, we're just going to keep having worse and worse flood damage because more people are moving into the floodplain thinking we're controlling the floods and we really can't. And I just wondered if there's been discussion in the Forest Service, maybe in connection with FEMA, to talk about the same thing, buying people out of the fire-prone zone, moving them out of it, and also helping local communities develop better land use planning to discourage people from moving up into the fire-prone zone.
I haven't heard any specific attempt to buy people out of the fire-prone zone. There's been discussion a lot of discussion with insurance companies that may have the effect of people leaving that zone if they can't get insurance or if insurance rates get too high. There has been that sort of discussion. There's been a lot of that discussion. It's a difficult situation because that's not the Forest Service's jurisdiction. That's the state or the county or the local community's jurisdiction, and that's truly where the question, I think, needs to be answered. I agree, and I just want to clarify something because I've heard it so many times, and it also relates to your question, that yes, we will have catastrophic fires, and there will be instances where nobody's going to be able to do anything to stop them. It's true, Jack Cohen's work does show that you need to clear and have defensible space within 200 feet of your residence or whatever it is you're trying to protect. And what that's talking about is the heat, the spontaneous combustion or the radiant heat that will cause the structure to ignite. It's also true what your home is or structure is built of is very important. But what causes most homes to burn down are the embers that land on your deck or on your rain gutter or some other place where they smolder for a while and then they ignite. And what treating the wildland urban interface on the federal lands and on the private lands does is it allows us to get firefighters in there. If the fuels have not been treated to a place that's safe to put firefighters there, we won't do it. And so we have no chance of saving the home, nor does the rural fire department. And so when we're talking about going beyond that 200 feet, it's not to prevent that heat from causing your house to catch on fire. It's to provide a safe ingress, egress, and place for the firefighters to fight it. So you have a crown fire that might get into that urban interface that's been treated. And in theory, and this is what we're testing, and I agree with everything that Tom said. In fact, I gave almost that same lecture to my employees about being careful and humility and all of that. But it's not about the heat part. It's about getting people in there safely and having that crown fire become a ground fire so that you can move people in there to help suppress fires. So that's sort of two answers to your one question. Did you want to?
I think and I don't understand the financial mechanics, but I think the state of Montana learned this last fire season that the federal government is not going to reimburse it with a blank check for whatever it costs to stand guard over people's homes, et cetera. That there's only going to be limited resources made available, which has freaked out our conservative Republican legislature because they had to come up with the money to balance the checkbook when they ended up with a much larger bill. So I think there are some financial changes taking place that's going to force the state legislature. It's not federal land. It's going to force the state legislature and state government to raise real questions about who should be responsible for protecting these homes. And as more of that burden gets shifted to the homeowner and the insurance company, I think you'll see some fairly dramatic changes. Some areas in Colorado have adopted land use ordinances where timbered areas on steep slopes you just can't build on because there's no way, there's no land treatment, there's no forest treatment, there's no fuels treatment, there's nothing you do short of paving it to keep fire from burning the houses down. So we're creeping that way, and Montana got the first shocking financial news, the first real incentive to look a bit more critically at who should bear the costs associated with the decision to live in a dangerous place.
Effective fuel treatment is going to have to happen on some sort of consistent time interval. Dr. Walker, what time interval would that be ecologically feasible? Dr. Powers, at what time interval would that be economic?
Well, that's a very good question. My sense is that in the lower elevation ponderosa pine types, I think that it's very clearly that the fuel treatments have to be very different than we often think of. And we've been talking about this social context that we're talking about this, fire makes smoke. And the only way to treat ponderosa pine sites is really, in any economic sense, in my mind, with fire, because of the fine fuels that are there that are produced every year. Clearly that our forests are much less productive than some of the sites I'm used to dealing with. So I would say in terms of timing, certainly within 10 years, the treatment would have to be redone. It really depends on the basal area of the stand. In western Montana, a lot of basal area is barely 60 square feet, so that's really marginal to produce that much fuel. So you have a little more time. In contrast to that, in California, if you were to have 50 square feet, you could burn every year. You could carry a fire in the fuels every year, so it's a little different treatment. If that answers your question in terms of the ecological side of things, yeah.
I'd just like to add a little bit to that. We're working with a lot of different a lot of projects where we're testing a lot of those things, and what we're finding is we don't have any scientific results yet, but a lot of the stands we can't run fire through them now as they exist because the fuels are too heavy. So we'll go in and mechanically treat them, whether that be through us going in there, cutting it down, piling it, and burning it. Very rarely it's through a commercial timber sale because the value isn't there, it's not commercial product. And then once we do that and we pile and remove that slash, then we run fire over it or under the stand, and then we come back in different time intervals, again, depending on the situation, depending on the ecosystem and how close it is to homes and that sort of thing. But our intent is, in that urban interface particularly, is to get it to a place that we can safely put fire through it on a regular interval.
The only thing I would add, I think it's true that the only cost-effective way of re-entering or retreating is with fire. Doing it mechanically is just way too costly. If one, and I think Dr. Fiedler's analysis indicates this, if one is willing to go to the drastic reduction in basal area that you saw in Matt Kohler's photograph, so very, very widely spaced trees. His analysis, and I think it's primarily based on computer modeling, but with some empirical support for the parameters used, was that you could go 50 years and the vast majority of the area would remain at relatively low fire risk. But that involves major change in the character of the forest, and whether that would be is ecologically appropriate or socially acceptable, I think is very, very unclear.
Oh.
Just as well.
My question's kind of more related to the procedural aspect of this whole thing. And you, Debbie, sort of alluded in your talk about kind of perpetuating this myth in my mind about how appeals and litigation are somehow tying up these fuel reduction projects long term. And I'm just wondering if you've seen, there's a really great study that just came out in northern Arizona, Helen Fortner, I think is her name. Hannah Fortner. That shows that the Forest Service doesn't have a database that they kept track of the fuel emissions for most of the region. And it just sort of reinforces this myth that has been really, in my mind, a central driver in this whole debate, that environmentalists are the bad guys here, and that every time the Forest Service tries to help the poor people in the community, environmentalists stand in the way. I guess I'm just wondering what your response is to the data that Matthew put up, and then also data that's coming from the Forest Service database. Where did that come from, and when did it go away?
I can't respond to the national, what actually is happening nationally. I know on the Lolo National Forest, I think it would be safe to say, and we do track it, that about 95% of our projects are appealed. In Region 1, that number is a lot higher than it is across the nation. We don't have a national data. I think we're developing a national database that does track that. So in some parts of the country, it's true. I can't speak for the entire country. I'm not saying environmentalists are bad people at all either. What it does, though, is what's happened is the appeal process, I think, is gotten to the point where it's not doing what it was intended to do. There's a lot of boilerplate appeals and then boilerplate answers to appeals, and we're not really working through solutions. So it's not quite working, and because of that, that's where I agree with you. Whether you agree with what the Act says or not, that collaborative process is the answer. Is sitting down and figuring out a way to work together and trust each other is really the answer. And as far as when are people going to stop talking about appeals and litigation, my guess is not for a while. And in some places it is very impactful, in other places it isn't. I think that was the first question. And then your second question, did you guys all hear the question? Okay. The second question was my reaction to Matthew's presentation. I have a lot of reactions, I guess, to it. Some of it I agree with, some of it I would love to sit and debate slide by slide with. A couple of reactions, I guess, that I have is after a fire goes through, there are a lot of trees with green needles that are dead. They haven't dropped their needles yet. They have gotten to the point where they can't survive, and they will turn red the next year or the following year. Also, green needles are not a good way to determine if a tree has bugs in it. Whether you can see the bugs up on the trunk of the tree, but again, before the tree the tree is dying and has gone past the point of no return before the needles drop or turn red. So that's, I guess, one reaction. Another reaction, more, I guess, in general, we've been talking about the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and I think what my sense is, or at least my perception is, the slides that we were showing are certainly, I'm sure they're true, they're real timber sales that are occurring. They weren't done, I don't believe, under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act authority. I'm sure they were done under other authorities. This is too new, I would think. And they were done under different purpose and needs. And if you look at what the purpose for some of those projects were, I haven't seen them and I don't know, but I think it would be interesting to go back and look why those were proposed and did they meet the intent of what they were intending to do, rather than did they meet the intent of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And then the last thing I would say is, the before and after slides, again, I would like to know the dates of the pictures. You can take a picture right after it burns and everything looks pretty nice and pretty green. 3 years later, it would look very different even if it wasn't harvested. So those are questions that I have, and that's just my gut reaction.
The photos were taken in 1998 and 2000 by Jeff Jewell at the Ecology Center from a project on the Kootenai National Forest in northwest Montana. There's a number of things there that I feel I need to address, and I do know quite a bit about the appeals process and the issue of analysis paralysis, having FOIA'd the Forest Service numerous times on it. Regardless of the purpose and need of any project, who in this room thinks any of those ancient old-growth forests should be cut down? So I think that's part of the point. I think anybody could care less what kind of purpose and need you come up with. We've cut down all our ancient old-growth forests. Not one, well, I think one person in this room thought they should be cut down. Well, that's 1% out of 100. Who in this room thinks we should be logging and developing our roadless wildlands? Same sort of response, but we see the Forest Service continuing to do that. When it comes to the issue of appeals, we should not look at the fact that a project is appealed as necessarily a bad thing or that makes the project an abysmal failure. We should be thankful that here in America we have public lands and that we do have a public process. That public process is continually being eroded, just like public process throughout our society right now. But thank goodness people do care. Thank goodness there are nonprofit groups, many of them who volunteer their time to go out into the forest and watchdog and monitor what the Forest Service is doing. So a lot of times the reason these projects are appealed is because the Forest Service couples the good with the bad. Perfect example was the Lolo post-burn plan. We saw in the environmental community a lot of good things coming out of the Lolo post-burn plan. We saw a lot of roads that were going to be removed. We saw a lot of watershed restoration. We saw there were some old mines up in the 9 Mile area, and there was going to be some mine reclamation in order to accept that part of the project, we had to accept a 35 million board foot timber sale. About half of the volume was coming from uninventoried roadless areas. So, you know, again, part of the issue is the coupling of the good with the bad. I don't think anybody here thinks that our public lands or our environment can take much more damage. I don't want to see a robbing Peter to pay Paul approach to restoring our national forests. We can't take 2 steps forward, 2 steps backwards and say we're restoring the health of our forest. So I think that's an issue. And when it comes to appeals, the facts are, there is this Northern Arizona study. They found that for such a politically contentious issue, there has been no comprehensive and systematic analysis of the outcomes of the Forest Service appeals process. What they did find in Region 1, which includes all of Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and portions of northern Idaho, they found that projects identified by the Forest Service as fuel reduction accounted for 1.9% of all appeals, and projects identified as prescribed burn accounted for 0.9%. When we FOIA'd Freedom of Information Act, which coincidentally is also being curtailed in certain instances, when we FOIA'd the Forest Service to find the only study that has said that appeals and litigation are a problem was a Forest Service study, which was called Factors Affecting Timely Mechanical Fuel Treatment Decisions. That was released on July 10th, 2002. On July 11th, the next day, we filed a FOIA with the Forest Service. Here's what we found. The GAO, keep in mind, when they looked at this 4 times, they did a pretty comprehensive job. Here's what we got back from the Forest Service. Quote, "The time frame for gathering the information used to develop this report was limited to hours. Thus, much of the information was provided orally in telephone interviews with a variety of Forest Service employees throughout the country." So again, the General Accounting Office, they're not an environmental group, they're not the Forest Service, they're the nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress. They've looked into it 4 times. One of the other times they looked into it, they always find that appeals and litigation aren't as big of a deal. They're finding that upwards of 90% of the projects go through in a timely manner, so on and so forth. They also found in another report in September 2003 that federal agencies have failed to identify the lands at risk of fire. This was just from last September. Federal agencies have failed to make community fire protection a priority, and the main reason fuel reduction projects could not proceed were due to weather and the diversion of fuel reduction funds to fight wildfire. The report also found while opposition was not a leading factor in slowing fuel reduction projects, quote, "While the issue of formal public resistance, such as appeals and litigation, has recently been contentious, only a few local land unit officials we visited with indicated that this type of resistance had delayed a particular fuel's treatment." I could go on and on about this for hours. Again, the environmental community, we support protecting forest, we support good projects. What we don't support is when we see them coupling the good with the bad, or when we see, you know, it's just really unfortunate that all of a sudden analysis paralysis is part of the problem. Environmentalists are out to destroy the forest, which is just a fascinating thing for me, somebody who works on these issues. So I've taken way too much time answering that, so thank you.
First of all, I'd just like to say thank you all for taking the time to come tonight. It's really valuable for us to hear diversity of views. My question I'd like to direct to Debbie. Do you agree with the assertion that trust in the agency has declined, not only with environmental groups, but with the general public also? And also, if so, what could the agency do to build trust, particularly with the community wildfire protection plans that are being initiated?
I do absolutely agree that I like the conspiracy of optimism discussion. I've said the same thing over and over again, is although adding some things, I think back during the time of the American dream of owning your own home, people wanted that from their national forest. It was a positive thing. It wasn't just the agency. But as society changed and changed their views of what they wanted from the national forest, the agency didn't change. And I think we earned a lot of that distrust. On the other hand, I was brought in the late 70s, early 80s as sort of a group of resource professionals that were not foresters or the traditional Forest Service employees to bring some reality into that conspiracy of optimism. And I can honestly say over the last 25 years, there have been huge, huge changes. But we really do have a huge problem with perception and trust. I could go on and on about the Lolo Post Burn Project, about why I don't think it was good and bad, but I won't do that tonight. I think we're starting to maybe gain a little bit of that trust back, and I really agree that this Healthy Forest Restoration Act and the Healthy Forest Initiative and how we implement it is going to make or break the agency. We need to do the right thing for the right reasons at the right time in the right place and involve people. We can't think that we know it all. We can't go out and again repeat what was done in the past. Certainly, it's not an exact science. We will be wrong. I think somebody said that, but it's okay. We need to be able to try and adapt and do it small. Don't do it big. And again, the collaborative process. I truly believe getting people with diverse interests together, out on the ground, looking at projects, talking about things, from everybody's point of view, will come up with a much better project that may not even be appealed or litigated. And again, to me, that's the important part, is having that discussion. I think the public absolutely need to be involved. They need to be involved more than they have been. What I was saying earlier, though, is that the appeals process might not be the right avenue. But again, I just think the proof is going to be in the pudding. I mean, this is it for us, and we need to show people that we are doing the right thing. It's a very diverse agency. We're not a homogenous agency with groupthink anymore. The debates that go inside of our office are exactly the debate we're having tonight. And so we just need to be able to show that to people, and I think how we'll do that is in the implementation of projects.
Debbie, can I just add on to that? I guess as moderator I can do this. Can you speak to multi-party monitoring, which is a provision in the Act and was originally sold in Congress as a way to build some of these bridges and this trust back?
And that is something we also used. It's under the Stewardship Contracting Authority, and it allows us to, because we couldn't based on some other laws, but it allows us to have people such as yourselves that are interested in what we're doing help us monitor and sort of be a third party to be out there looking at what it was we said we wanted to do, what was the intent of the project, was it effective, is the first thing, or actually the first thing is, did we do what we said we were going to do? And the second question would be, was it effective? And if not, again, there's requirements in this act for us to go back and adapt. So again, that's another, I think, great opportunity for public involvement and actually an increase in public involvement.
And Matthew, would you be willing to participate in this sort of approach?
Oh yeah, I think, and looking out in the audience, I know there's a lot of people that work on these issues a lot, and I think you can appreciate the frustration of knowing that ancient forests are falling today, that roadless areas are being entered into, that sort of reality, and dealing with that, and then hearing that, you know, we're an agency or an administration that wants healthy forest can be a bit frustrating. My organization, we are a very small organization. We have participated in the Frenchtown Face project, which is a project that the Lolo National Forest is looking to implement. It's kind of one of these pre-scoping sort of a projects where you get the parties together early. We're doing something with some district rangers on both the Bitterroot and the Lolo called Breaking New Ground, a project that we're working with the forest and also the National Forest Foundation. And groups are doing this all around the country. The same people who are the ones filing the appeals are many of the same people who are the ones going out monitoring, going out talking to the Forest Service. Any district ranger or appeals officer will tell you that, or any project leader on the Lolo or the Bitterroot or any forest will tell you that the environmentalists that they probably know best are the ones that are the ones appealing what we feel are misguided projects, or a lot of times appeals can make a project better. You know, the Forest Service doesn't know anything. We sure don't know everything. I sure don't know everything, but you know, by getting people together, we can build better projects. So that is happening. For us, it's a little bit strange to be doing that when also, you know, we're planning to get 1,000 people out to protest an auction of an ancient old-growth sale in Oregon. But so be it. That's what we need to do, we feel, to protect and restore our national forests. So yeah, the environmental community is involved in all aspects. We're involved in the litigation in the courtroom. We're involved in the forest and in the halls of Congress. So.
I think what's striking in this discussion is that there are multiple levels of action, as you just alluded to going on, and not just within the environmental community, but you know, many in this room, as you said, and certainly in the agency, there are multiple levels of action that are ongoing in implementation of any type of policy. But, and I'm going to direct this, of course, to Debbie, but I wonder what specifically, and I think Paul asked this as well, but to reiterate, you know, what specific public involvement steps can the agency take to help rebuild that trust? Multi-party monitoring is kind of a new, somewhat nebulous thing, doesn't have the appropriations, as you alluded to before, to maybe experiment with some different models for that. I think that holds some promise, but you know, I guess I open it up to a discussion of maybe not just to you, but other folks in terms of brainstorming what actual ways to build trust at the local level that can kind of circumvent the national level political shenanigans that are obviously happening. I mean, nobody in this room would say that, you know, there isn't a national level political struggle that's been ongoing for 30 years. But, you know, if we do want to build trust at the local level, what specific things can we do?
I'll start, and then I'd love to hear from everybody else what they think, because I don't know it all. One of the things Matthew just talked about it, that I really believe in is getting people together before we know what we want to do. Before we scope, before we have a proposed action, get a group of people together, as we did in Frenchtown Face, and say, here's a piece of land. This is what we know about it. We asked the community and interested people, what do you know about it? And then they helped us develop, so is there anything we need to do here or not? And if there is, what are they? And in a collaborative way, come up with a proposed action and then the alternatives. It's really tough for everybody. We're all human. Once you have an idea, it's hard to get off that idea and do something different. And NEPA sets us up for that. So again, I think getting together, talking about things long before we have a proposed action is one way. The community fire plans, I think, are going to be an excellent way, because a community has all kinds of incentive now to get together and figure out what they want to do within their interface before anything is proposed. So I think those kinds of things, again, really very, very early on, do that. Forest plan revision. We're right now in the process of revising our forest plan. So that's really the document that sets the stage for everything we'll do in the future. People need to be involved. We're working with the Lolo, the Bitterroot, and the Flathead on revision. We've got 12 collaborative groups going right now, trying to help us work through a lot of those issues. So to me, again, it's just very, very early discussion. Anybody?
The thing I would add is that if there aren't significant appropriations forthcoming, the Forest Service is going to be in a very difficult situation with the expectation that it's going to manage fuels and reduce fuels, but with no funding other than timber sales to do so. Meanwhile, without adequate appropriations, they'll continue to have to shift resources from non-commercial, other non-commercial, environmentally oriented forest management projects towards simply firefighting. So I think the national battle that you allude to is likely, I don't want to be completely pessimistic, but it's likely to play out in a not very good way, simply because the folks whose votes will be needed to provide the dollars, I think, expect significant commercial fiber to flow to mills as a result of fuel reduction. If those dollars are guided primarily towards the sorts of projects that I would think would help rebuild trust, I don't think there will be a lot of additional fiber flowing to mills. So I think the agency is in a difficult position given the political battle that has not been settled at the national level, and given the balance of power at the national level. So I've heard even Mark Ray say that they're going to prove the environmentalists wrong by doing this right. Whether the appropriations will be provided to allow the agency to do that, I have real doubts. And if it's not available, I'm not sure it can be done right. The pressures will be to do it wrong, and it may well get done wrong, in which case Matthew has his work cut out for him, and we face, a hell of a period going forward.
I wanted to add, and if you want to say something in a minute, but I just wanted to add that nationally there is this big debate, and there is pressure, and there are people from all sides trying to make this happen to their benefit. I can honestly say, as a forest supervisor, there's a whole lot of filters before it gets down to me and the projects I propose and the decisions I make. This year in particular, it's the first year under the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. We've been talking nationally, we've been talking regionally and locally about going out there and implementing those hazardous fuel reduction projects, which on my forest and on most forests are in terms of prescribed burning. There's been very little talk about commercial timber harvest in relation to this. Almost nothing. So in the first year of it, that hasn't become reality, but there certainly are those pressures, but just to know there's a lot of buffer between those pressures and the people that are making the decisions.
Well, I think the quickest way to get the trust of the environmental community, and I would think the trust of a lot